You've heard the name critical race theory. It's pretty much everywhere these days. But chances are you haven't heard what its founders actually said it was. So in this explainer, we're going to go straight to the source to understand its origins. And our guide for this journey is the introduction to a really foundational 1995 book called Critical Race Theory: The Key Writings That Formed the Movement. What's so important about this is that the intro was written by the very scholars who created the field. So we're going to be exploring what they said in their own words. You know, we've all seen the headlines, the cable news debates. It gets pretty heated. So let's just cut through all of that noise for a minute and ask a really simple question. What did the founders of critical race theory actually say it was? That's what we're here to figure out. All right, so let's start at the very beginning, the most fundamental question of all. According to this text, what exactly is critical race theory? Okay, so right off the bat, they say it isn't some single rigid doctrine. They describe it as a movement of scholars, mostly people of color, who were united by two key interests. First, they wanted to understand how American law and society construct race and racial power. And second, they didn't just want to study it, they wanted to actively change that relationship. But why? What problem was this new movement trying to solve? Well, the authors explain that it really grew out of this deep sense of dissatisfaction with how civil rights were being handled and talked about in the years after the 1960s. And here's where they draw a really sharp contrast. They say the mainstream view tended to look at racism as something intentional, a rare act by a specific bad apple, an aberration in what was otherwise a fair system. But the CRT scholars came back and said, no, that's not it at all. They argued that racism wasn't an aberration, it was systemic. It was woven into the very fabric of our institutions and how they function. This quote really gets to the heart of their critique. What they're arguing is that by focusing only on individual bigots, the traditional approach to civil rights actually left the underlying power structures totally untouched. And by doing that, it allowed society to condemn racism while still claiming it was rare, which, in their view, just ended up legitimizing a system they saw as an unfair meritocracy. And that's why these scholars saw the whole ideal of colorblindness as a major barrier, not the solution. Their argument was pretty straightforward. If you pretend you don't see race, then you can't possibly see the ways that racial power operates in society. And if you can't see it, well, there's no way you can fix it. Now, these ideas didn't just appear out of a vacuum. The authors are really clear that a huge influence on critical race theory was another movement that was brewing in law schools at the time, known as critical legal studies, or CLS for short. So the scholars of CLS, or crits as they were sometimes called, were really challenging this core idea that the law is neutral and objective. They argue that no, the law is inherently political. They said it often works to maintain an unjust social order. And this idea that the law isn't some neutral referee became a critical building block for CRT. So you have these abstract ideas floating around. How did they turn into a full-fledged movement with a name? Well, according to the founders, the spark that really lit the fire happened at Harvard Law School back in the early 1980s. The central figure in this story is Professor Derek Bell. See, at a time when law was being taught as if it were colorblind, Bell did something that was seen as pretty radical. He put race right at the absolute center of his legal work. He argued that it wasn't just some side issue, but a fundamental, organizing principle of American law. And to give you a sense of just how controversial his work was at the time, the authors use this really powerful analogy. They compare what Bell was doing to the Black Power salute at the 1968 Olympics. Just like those athletes insisted on their racial identity on a global stage, Bell was insisting on the centrality of race in a field that was desperately trying to ignore it. So here's how the story unfolds. In 1980, Derek Bell leaves Harvard. A group of students, mostly students of color, demand that the school replace him with another scholar of color. But the administration's response was that no qualified candidates existed. So, in protest, the students boycotted the official replacement course and decided to create their very own, the alternative course. In this student-run course, it became this pivotal moment. The organizers brought in visiting scholars of color from all over, many of whom went on to become leaders in the field. And the authors identified this specific act of protest and creation as the very first institutional expression of what would later become known as critical race theory. So, when you put it all together, what does it add up to? Well, the authors described their whole project as a unique dual intervention. Basically, they were aiming to reshape two different big conversations all at once. So what does that mean, dual intervention? Well, on one hand, it was a left intervention into the conversation about race. They were pushing back against mainstream liberal ideas like colorblindness. But on the other hand, it was a race intervention into left-wing legal theory. They took the tools from critical legal studies, but they also criticized that movement for not focusing nearly enough on the specific role of race and racial power. So when you go back to the source, what you find is a story. A theory born from dissatisfaction, built on existing ideas, and really sparked into life by student protest. And all of this leaves us with one last question to think about. How does knowing the specific problems a theory was created to solve change how we understand its purpose in all the debates we're having today?